In the last video I looked at different ways to make a tray. Today I want to cover those trays. Again, there are many different ways to accomplish this, but what I'm going to demonstrate is a common approach used in the bookbinding community. Some of the tiny details vary a lot, such as how to trim the corners on the inside bottom of the wall, but I think this is a solid approach and most variations are not far from it. But I reserve the right to change how I do it in the future if I find a better way. I'll let you know if I do. I'll look at two main scenarios. First is if the tray were a lid and the top needs to be a solid piece of covering material. It will cover the top, go down the walls, wrap over the edges, down the inside of the walls and onto the inside of the top. The second is if the top doesn't need a solid covering. Maybe it will sit on a base. A strip of cloth will wrap around the tray which extends onto the top and wraps the walls the same as the first approach. This can save covering material. I'll also look at lining the inside of the trays. I'll do a separate video for each of these, one for each of the covering methods and one for the lining. In this video I'll do the covering that has a solid top. These covering approaches ensure none of the board is visible, and at the long joins, such as the inside and outside corners and the bottom of the inside walls, there is an overlap of material, so a gap is unlikely to open up in the future where the underlying board might be visible. It might also add a bit of strength. I'll start with the solid covering on the top. I prefer to measure or mark most things from the tray rather than calculating dimensions and then marking them with a ruler. You can't get rid of measuring completely, but I think this approach is simpler to follow and remember and less prone to mistakes. I start with a piece of covering material with a right angle corner. I draw lines 10 millimeters in from each square edge. This 10 millimeters is the part that extends onto the inside of the base. Then the cloth has to go up and down the walls, so I use the tray to measure two wall thicknesses. Then I position the tray between these lines and trace around it. Then I do the same on the other side, two wall thicknesses and 10 millimeters. I glue the outside of the tray and position it on the covering material. A thin, absorbent covering material will be a problem for this type of covering, and you may need to line it to make it usable. The first overlap will be on the outside corners, and it's usual to have the overlap on the short ends. Parallel to the short ends, the covering material is cut out from the corners. Similarly, this is done parallel to the long ends except 10 millimeters out from the edge to give the overlap material. This overlap piece only needs to be the height of the wall, and it can be trimmed to height now or after gluing. There is merit in both approaches. Now that 10mm measurement isn't set in stone. You could use 5mm, 12mm, 15mm, quarter of an inch, half an inch, or even 3/8. I usually use 10mm. The overlapping flap only needs to be the height of the walls, so I'll trim that up now. The long walls are glued along with a bit at each end for the overlap material, and the covering material folded up and smoothed out. Then the end walls are glued and the covering material applied too. With the magic of video time travel, here is both trays covered on the outside. On this first tray, I didn't trim that piece of overlap material above the walls. I'll do that now so that both trays match exactly at this point in construction, and all steps from now on will be the same. Now the covering material needs to turn over the walls and down the inside. We're going to do a tiny little mitre on the top of the walls at the corners, and the inside overlap is going to be small, just the width of the walls. Fold the covering material over the walls, pulling it down slightly inside the tray. Then drag your knife across the corner with the knife leaning slightly down to the outside. I just want to cut through the two layers of covering material and as little as possible into the top of the walls, and only across the top of the walls and not beyond. This is easier than it might look or sound when described. There will be a small overlap of material on the inside of the walls in the corner. The overlap material will come from the longer sides. This material will go down first. The short ends are trimmed so the covering material goes down exactly in the corner. The short ends are put down last to cover the overlapping material. On the short ends, from the end of the neck from the mitre over the edge of the wall, trim the covering material so it's flush with the inside of the walls. I'm using 2.5mm board, so it will be 2.5mm trimmed off. I don't measure it, I just align the ruler with the inside of the edge of the wall. For the long sides, we don't want to trim these edges as that is the overlap material for the inside corners. But to make it fold nicely over the top of the wall, and so there isn't a lump from overlapping material on the top of the wall, the tiny little triangle of material that makes the top mitre is removed. This is done for the four corners. There's one last thing to do before gluing the covering material to the inside. It's best to reduce the bulk of material that ends up on the inside of the base of the tray. In the past, I would have glued everything in place and then cut through the double layer of material and removed the overlap, producing the perfect mitre. This is very fiddly and not worth it. The inside is always lined, so this mitre doesn't have to be perfect, just the overlapping material removed. So before applying glue, I push the covering material down into the corner with a pointy bone folder. Once the covering material is in place, I mark the inside corner with an awl. I then unfold the covering material and cut it at 45 degrees to the prick mark, and for the long sides I cut outwards the small amount of overlap material. Some people will just cut this off at 45 degrees, and that's probably perfectly fine and easier. Habits are hard to change. For the short edges, I push the covering material into the tray and put a crease line in the cloth with the pointy bone folder along the edge of the material I just trimmed, and then I cut along this crease. The long edges are glued out and the covering material wrapped over the boards and into the tray. Smooth it out well and then turn in the short ends. This is when I really like the square-ended Teflon folders, as they make nice crisp inside edges and are less likely to polish the covering material if you use them a bit harshly. Now that you've seen how easy it is to cover a tray, I hope you feel confident doing one yourself. As always, I really appreciate you hitting the big thumbs up button. If you're able and want to, you can support the making of more videos like this through Patreon or with a one-off contribution, and the details are in the description below. If you want to be notified of my future videos, please hit the subscribe button. Until next time, cheerio.